10 ancient discoveries so impossible they rewrite human history. It was a Tuesday morning in October 1900. A Greek sponge diver named Elias Stadiates descended 45 meters into the Aegean Sea near a tiny, unremarkable island called Antikythera. He was looking for sponges. What he found instead, lying on the sea floor beside shattered marble statues and corroded bronze sculptures, was a lump of green-encrusted metal about the size of a shoebox. They pulled it to the surface. They cataloged it, and then for the next 2 years, it sat in a museum in Athens gathering dust while everyone focused on the statues. In 1902, an archaeologist named Spyridon Stais glanced at it during a routine visit and noticed something that nobody else had. Inside the corroded bronze lump, embedded deep within decades of sea growth and oxidation, were gears, precision-cut, interlocking bronze gears, each tooth approximately 1 millimeter in length. The experts were immediately called in, and then immediately baffled because what they were looking at was mechanically impossible, not theoretically difficult, not archaeologically unusual, impossible, according to everything the scientific community believed about ancient technology at the time. British physicist Derek de Solla Price spent 2 decades studying the object. In 1959, after X-ray imaging confirmed over 30 interlocking gear wheels inside the device, Price made a statement that would become one of the most quoted lines in the history of archaeology. He said, "Finding this device in this context is like finding a jet engine in Tutankhamun's tomb." This machine, later confirmed to be approximately 2,100 years old, could predict the movements of the sun, the moon, and all 5 planets known to the ancient world. It tracked 4-year Olympic cycles. It calculated eclipse patterns using mathematical ratios so precise they wouldn't be replicated again until the 14th century. University College London researchers reconstructed it in 2021 using CT scans and concluded the device synthesized Babylonian astronomy, Platonic mathematics, and Greek astronomical theory into a single hand-cranked mechanism. There was only one of it ever found. No workshops, no spare parts, no lineage of progression from simpler to more complex. It appeared fully formed inside a Roman cargo ship that sank somewhere around 60 BCE, and then it vanished from human knowledge for 2,000 years. Here is the question that science has not answered. If something this sophisticated existed in 100 BCE, what happened to the civilization that made it? Where did the knowledge go? Why did it take 14 centuries for humanity to rediscover gearing of equivalent complexity? And here is the question that science refuses to ask. What else did they build that we haven't found yet? That mechanism was number 1. Stay with me, because what comes next is considerably stranger. Discovery number 1. Göbekli Tepe, the temple that shouldn't exist. In 1963, archaeologists surveying a hilltop in southeastern Turkey dismissed it as a medieval cemetery. They were wrong by approximately 9,000 years. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at a dusty mound near the city of Şanlıurfa, a site called Göbekli Tepe, meaning belly hill, and recognized something the previous survey had missed entirely. Embedded in the earth were the tops of massive limestone T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with precision animal reliefs and abstract symbols. Schmidt began excavating the following year. What emerged from the ground dismantled one of the foundational assumptions of human history. The structures at Göbekli Tepe are 11,600 years old. That places them 6,000 years before Stonehenge and 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. The builders had no metal tools, no pottery, no writing, no domesticated animals, no agriculture. According to every model of human development that existed before 1994, they should have been capable of nothing more complex than a temporary shelter. Instead, they built what is now recognized as the world's oldest known monumental architecture. 25 circular enclosures have been mapped using ground-penetrating radar across 22 acres. The pillars, some standing 6 meters tall, feature carvings of lions, foxes, scorpions, birds, and abstract human forms, with carved hands resting precisely on stone stomachs. Here is where it gets strange. A 2017 study published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal analyzed the construction geometry and found that 3 of the site's main enclosures align almost perfectly on the vertices of an equilateral triangle. The builders appear to have stretched rope to a pre-calculated length to achieve this accuracy. This is not the accidental outcome of intuitive construction. This is deliberate geometric planning by a society we have until now called primitive hunter-gatherers. And then there's the question of why it was buried. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was not overtaken by a rival culture. Sometime around 8000 BCE, the builders returned to each of the enclosures and deliberately, methodically filled them with rubble and sediment, sealing the pillars underground. The carvings were preserved in extraordinary condition, not by accident, but by an intentional act that required organized labor on a substantial scale. They built something monumental, and then they hid it. Mainstream archaeology has settled on the interpretation that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual gathering site that actually preceded agriculture, that the need to feed the labor force required to build and maintain it may have driven the development of farming. It flips the entire assumed sequence of civilization. Religion didn't come after civilization, it may have caused it. But here is what mainstream archaeology has not been able to explain. As of 2024, less than 10% of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar indicates at least 16 more enclosure rings buried across the remaining acreage. We don't know what's in them. We don't know how deep this goes. We don't know if the structures change as they descend through older and older strata. What we do know is that this complex was built by people who, by every previous definition, weren't capable of building it. And whoever they were, they chose to bury it and leave. The question isn't whether they were intelligent. The question is what else they knew. Discovery number 2. Puma Punku, the blocks that can't be explained. High on the Bolivian Altiplano, at an altitude of nearly 12,800 feet, above the tree line and in a landscape with no nearby stone quarries, lie the ruins of a site that engineers still cannot fully account for. Puma Punku, Gate of the Puma, is a pre-Columbian complex near Tiwanaku that contains something archaeologists do not like to dwell on too long: stone blocks that appear to have been machined. The red sandstone and andesite stones are cut to tolerances that not even a razor blade can penetrate. They interlock in 3-dimensional configurations, similar to a complex jigsaw puzzle, requiring no mortar and creating load-bearing joints of extraordinary precision. Surfaces that should show the marks of stone tools are flat to a degree that modern engineers find difficult to replicate manually. The largest single block on the site weighs approximately 131 metric tons. It was transported approximately 10 kilometers from a quarry near Lake Titicaca. The smaller andesite blocks used for the intricate precision carvings came from quarries on the Copacabana Peninsula, roughly 90 kilometers away, across water, without wheels, without the horse, which had not yet been domesticated in South America, without cranes or iron tools. Here is what stops the conversation cold. One block in particular, photographed and studied repeatedly, now referenced in dozens of academic debates, contains a perfectly straight groove running along its length with 6-millimeter holes drilled at precise identical intervals directly into the cut face. The holes are perfectly circular. The spacing is uniform to within fractions of a millimeter. In 2022, archaeologists using modern drill equipment attempted to replicate the process using methods available to the Tiwanaku culture. They could not reproduce the hole uniformity. The holes exist. The explanation doesn't. Researcher Alexei Vranich of the University of California, Berkeley, spent years at the site attempting a 3D printed architectural reconstruction of what Puma Punku originally looked like intact. The project suggested that the structures were once precisely assembled modular buildings, almost prefabricated in their regularity, where the blocks were designed to be interchangeable within a construction system. Prefabrication. Mass production of standardized stone components in the 6th century AD. The official date of construction, based on radiocarbon samples taken from organic material at the site, places Puma Punku between roughly 500 and 600 CE. But Austrian archaeologist Arthur Poznański, one of the earliest researchers to study the site systematically, believed based on astronomical alignment analysis that the complex was orders of magnitude older, potentially dating to 15,000 BCE. No one has definitively proven him wrong. The mainstream position is that the Tiwanaku culture, which supported an estimated 400,000 people at its height, simply developed extraordinary stone working techniques that we have not yet fully reverse-engineered. That is a rational position. It is also, when you stand in front of those blocks and measure the tolerances with modern instruments, deeply unsatisfying. The Tiwanaku civilization collapsed suddenly around 1000 CE. Likely drought. Their cities were abandoned, their population scattered, and whatever knowledge allowed them to cut stone to those tolerances went with them. No written records, no tools recovered, no instruction manual, just the blocks sitting on the Bolivian Altiplano, perfectly cut, waiting for an explanation that hasn't arrived yet. Discovery number 3. The Dendera Enigma. When science built what history says didn't exist. Deep in a subterranean crypt in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, Egypt, a temple dated to the Ptolemaic period, roughly 225 BCE, there are 3 stone reliefs that have been debated continuously since European explorers first documented them in the 19th century. They depict what appears unmistakably to be an oversized glass bulb. Inside it, a serpent-like figure coils in the precise curved shape of a filament. Below it, a structure that resembles an electrical insulator. At its base, what looks like a wired connection to a power source. Mainstream Egyptologists interpret this as religious imagery, a lotus flower, a serpent deity, and a jed pillar, all familiar elements of Egyptian cosmological symbology. They are not wrong that these elements exist. The inscriptions surrounding the carvings reference Harsamtus, a serpent god, rising from the lotus of creation. That is a legitimate reading. But here is where the story breaks. In 1978, Austrian electrical engineer Walter Garn constructed a working model based directly on the Dendera relief dimensions. He evacuated a glass bulb replicating the proportions in the carving, introduced electrodes at the positions shown in the relief, and reduced internal pressure to approximately 40 millimeters of mercury. At that pressure, a luminous, undulating filament of light appeared inside the glass, snaking from one electrode to the other in precisely the shape of the serpent depicted on the wall of the temple. He had built what the carving showed, and it worked. The establishment responded the same way it always does. The Baghdad Battery, a Parthian-era ceramic vessel containing a copper cylinder and iron rod, discovered near Baghdad and capable of producing between 3 and 5 volts when filled with acidic solution, is over 1,000 miles from Dendera and predates the Egyptian use by centuries. There is no evidence of wiring. There is no glass in the archaeological record of the temple. The absence of soot in some Egyptian chambers, offered as evidence of artificial lighting, can be explained by post-excavation cleaning. Every one of those counterarguments is scientifically valid. What they don't explain is why an electrical engineer building a device from a 2,200-year-old stone carving produced a functional light source. They don't explain why the serpent inside the lotus assumes a coiled filament configuration when you look at the carvings under enhanced imaging. And they don't explain a single line from the temple's own inscriptions, a line that Egyptologist Dr. Wolfgang Whitekus translated as part of the surrounding text that references Harsamtus as alive with gloss in the sky, who lights up in its house in the night of the child in his nest, donating light to the country from the birth bricks. Alive with gloss, donating light. Maybe it's a metaphor. Almost certainly it's a metaphor. But the device that Garn built still works. It sits in a lab, glowing, and no one has a comfortable answer for why. Discovery number 4. The map that ends the argument. On January 1, 1929, a group of scholars examining old documents in the Ottoman Imperial Archives in Istanbul found a map. It had been drawn in 1513 CE by a Turkish admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. The document was not hidden, it was not classified, it was simply overlooked, sitting in the archives for over 4 centuries. When researchers unrolled it, they found a remarkably detailed rendering of the coastlines of Europe, North Africa, and, this is the problem, South America. At a time when South America had been discovered by European explorers for fewer than 2 decades, the map showed the continent's eastern coastline with cartographic accuracy that surpassed what was possible with 16th-century instruments. Then they looked at the bottom of the map. Along what should have been blank ocean in the map's southern region, Piri Reis had drawn a continuous landmass coastline extending horizontally, a landmass that, in shape and position, corresponded to the coastal contours of Antarctica. Antarctica, a continent that, in 1513, had never been seen by any human being whose existence is recorded in the historical record. Antarctica would not be officially discovered until 1820. And here is what breaks the comfortable explanation. In 1959, Captain Lorenzo Burroughs of the United States Air Force submitted the Piri Reis map to cartographic analysis at Westover Air Force Base. His team compared the southern coastline on the map against modern surveys of Antarctica, including surveys conducted beneath the ice sheet, which covers the actual bedrock coastline. The map showed not the surface of the ice, which is what a modern observer would draw. It showed the subglacial coastline, the actual shape of the Antarctic continent as it exists under approximately a mile of ice. Ice that has been there for at least 6,000 years. The standard academic explanation is a combination of coincidence, distorted projection, and medieval cartographic speculation, the common tradition of drawing a hypothetical southern continent, the Terra Australis, to balance the known northern land masses. That is not a frivolous explanation. But it doesn't account for the subglacial accuracy. It doesn't explain how speculative lines happen to correspond to surveying data that wasn't gathered until the 20th century. And it doesn't answer the question Piri Reis himself raised in annotations on the map, where he noted that he had compiled his chart from a number of older source maps, some of which, he wrote, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. Where did those source maps come from? What civilization mapped Antarctica before the ice? That question has never been answered. It has only been louder silences. Discovery number 5. Sacsayhuamán, the stone that fits. Above the city of Cuzco, Peru, at an altitude of 3,700 meters, stands a fortress wall that has withstood 5 centuries of Spanish occupation, multiple major earthquakes, and the particular kind of destruction that comes from a conqueror who dismantles everything he can to build a new city from the rubble. The Spanish took almost everything. The blocks small enough to carry, they carried. The blocks that could be split, they split. What remains standing today at Sacsayhuamán are the blocks that could not be moved, could not be broken, and could not be incorporated into anything else. These are the ones weighing between 100 and 200 metric tons. The walls are constructed of polygonal limestone blocks, irregular, multi-sided pieces that interlock with their neighbors in configurations so precise that, as engineers have repeatedly confirmed, a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. Not a credit card, not a blade. Paper. The tolerances are measured in fractions of a millimeter. Every block is different. Not a single one is a standard shape. Each piece was carved to fit specifically against its specific neighbors, a three-dimensional interlocking system of irregular forms spanning walls that run for over 300 meters, fitted together so tightly that the 1650 earthquake that leveled most of colonial Cuzco left the Sacsayhuamán walls standing without movement. Here is the engineering question that has never been answered to anyone's satisfaction. How do you plan that? Before cutting begins, someone must have known the precise three-dimensional profile of each stone's contact surfaces with its 3, 4, or 5 neighboring blocks. You cannot cut stone iteratively. Remove a little here, check the fit, remove a little more. Stone removal is irreversible. The tolerances require that the final shape of each block be pre-planned before the first cut. Modern architects modeling the construction process using computer-aided design have concluded that the planning required to achieve these interlocks would have been extraordinary even with contemporary software. Without it, using only the cognitive capacity of individual human minds and physical mock-ups, it represents a scale of geometric problem-solving that sits uncomfortably outside the assumed capabilities of a 14th-century Andean civilization. The Incas themselves, when the Spanish asked them who built Sacsayhuamán, said they didn't know. They said it was built by the Viracochas, beings of a prior age, before the Inca, beings with knowledge the Inca could not explain. The Spanish wrote this down. Then they spent the next century dismantling everything they could reach. What they left standing is still there, still fitted, still unanswered. Discovery number 6. The Blinkerwall. Europe's impossible megastructure. In February 2024, researchers from the University of Rostock published findings that received far less attention than they deserved. Using high-resolution hydroacoustic imaging, sonar scanning of the Baltic Sea floor, a team led by Dr. Philip Hoy identified a submerged stone wall structure off the coast of Germany. The structure, named the Blinkerwall, sits at a depth of approximately 20 meters and consists of roughly 1,400 small stones connecting 300 larger boulders in a continuous line stretching nearly 1 kilometer. Initial analysis dated the structure to approximately 10,000 BCE, placing its construction at the end of the last ice age, when the Baltic region was still dry land. At that time, the Blinkerwall would have been a land-based structure. Rising sea levels in the millennia following the Ice Age submerged it completely, preserving it on the seafloor in extraordinary condition. The leading hypothesis is that it was used to funnel migrating reindeer herds, the way modern wildlife managers use directional barriers to guide animals toward specific locations for hunting. If correct, this makes the Blinkerwall the oldest known evidence of organized, large-scale hunting strategy in Europe, a coordinated behavioral management structure requiring planning, communication, and sustained cooperative labor across a hunter-gatherer population. But here is what the researchers noted quietly, in a line that sits at the end of their paper almost as an afterthought. The scale of coordinated effort required to place 1,400 stones in a precisely configured alignment spanning approximately 971 meters implies a level of social organization and forward planning in the late Stone Age that substantially exceeds previous models for that period. 1 kilometer of organized stone placement, underwater, waiting since the Ice Age. We found it 68 feet below the surface of the Baltic Sea in 2024. The question nobody is asking loudly enough: how many more are there? Discovery number 7. The Upano Valley, the city we weren't supposed to find. For over a century, the dominant narrative of ancient Amazonia held that the rainforest's poor tropical soils made large-scale agriculture impossible, and therefore large-scale civilization impossible, and therefore the Amazon basin was sparsely populated by small, nomadic groups until relatively recently. In January 2024, that narrative was publicly retired. A multinational research team published results in the journal Science detailing LiDAR scanning, laser ground sensing technology, across the Upano Valley in Ecuador. The scans cut through the forest canopy and revealed what lay beneath: more than 6,000 interconnected earthen platforms, raised field systems, ceremonial plazas, and road networks spanning approximately 300 square kilometers. What they had found was not a village, not a ceremonial site, not a series of small settlements. They had found a city. Several connected cities, in fact, with a road infrastructure linking them, straight roads running for kilometers with precise geometric intersections, built approximately 2,500 years ago by a civilization that had been entirely invisible to archaeology until the moment a laser looked through the trees. The Upano complex predates other comparable Amazonian societies by more than 1,000 years. Researchers estimate the population of the Upano Valley at its height may have reached tens of thousands. They had intensive agricultural systems designed to manage the very soil conditions that were assumed to make large-scale civilization impossible in the Amazon. They developed their own engineering solutions to problems that mainstream models said they should never have encountered, because mainstream models said they should never have been there. This isn't a marginal anomaly. This is an entire civilization, organized, engineered, populated, and sustained, that history forgot entirely. Not lost in the sense of destroyed, lost in the sense of never looked for, because the models said it couldn't be there. The researcher leading the project, Dr. Antoine Dorison, said the discovery forces a complete reassessment of human occupation of the Amazon. And here is the uncomfortable implication he did not state directly, but which the data implies. If a civilization of this scale went undetected for 2,500 years in Ecuador, what else is under the canopy? The Amazon basin covers 5.5 million square kilometers. LiDAR surveys have covered a fraction of that. The scanning that found Upano took a few weeks. The remaining basin would take decades. What we know about ancient Amazonia is essentially what we could see from the ground. We've barely looked from above. Discovery number 8. The Canaanite Shipwreck. They weren't supposed to be out there. The textbooks said ancient Mediterranean sailors stayed near the coast, not because of lack of ability, but because of lack of incentive. The prevailing model held that Bronze Age seafarers hugged the shoreline, navigating by visible landmarks, stopping frequently, following routes that kept them within sight of land. Deep water navigation, the use of stars to cross open ocean far from any coast, that was assumed to be a much later development. In 2024, underwater robots deployed by an oil and gas survey company off the coast of Israel made a discovery that was not supposed to be there. At a depth of 1.8 kilometers, nearly 2 kilometers below the surface, they found a Canaanite shipwreck, intact, 3,300 years old. the cargo still aboard. Every Bronze Age shipwreck previously known to archaeology had been found near the coastline, consistent with the navigation model. This one was in open water, deep water, 40 kilometers from the nearest shore, a distance that would require deliberate deep water navigation, out of sight of land, almost certainly using stellar positioning. In the Bronze Age, 3,300 years ago, the researchers noted the obvious implication. Ancient Mediterranean seafarers were navigating deep water far from the coast centuries earlier than the established timeline allowed. The ship wasn't lost near shore and swept to depth. It sank where it was sailing. Where was it going? The cargo provides partial answers. The trajectory provides partial answers. But the full route, who sailed it, from where, carrying what, for whom, is still open. And the larger question, the one that connects to every other anomaly on this list, is the one that no single discovery can resolve on its own. How many other things did they do that we assumed they couldn't? How many other capabilities, technologies, routes, and systems existed in the ancient world and simply didn't survive in a form that fits our models? Discovery number 9, Karahan Tepe and the Stone Faces. 30 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe, buried under the same Turkish soil, excavation teams began uncovering a new site in 2019 that may be even older. Karahan Tepe. While the world's attention was fixed on Göbekli Tepe, Turkish and German archaeologists were quietly unearthing an enclosure at Karahan Tepe that contained something Göbekli Tepe did not: human faces carved directly into the bedrock. Not reliefs, not paintings, three-dimensional carved human heads, life-size, emerging from the stone floor and walls as if half-submerged, faces gazing upward from the ground level of the enclosure. Alongside them, stone phalluses, approximately 2 meters tall, carved from the living rock, and at the center, a seated human torso, carved in 3 dimensions, of a quality and anatomical accuracy that belongs comfortably in a museum of classical sculpture. This was created approximately 11,000 years ago by the same peoples, or people contemporary with the peoples who built Göbekli Tepe, the hunter-gatherers, the ones without pottery, without writing, without agriculture. Archaeologist Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, who leads the excavation, described the Karahan Tepe enclosure as a ritual space unlike anything previously known from this period. The seated figure's hands are shown gripping large serpents. The stone faces peer upward from the ground in expressions that researchers have called, and there is no more clinical word for it, haunting. Here's the detail that changes the texture of the entire discussion. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars are abstract. Scholars believe they represent human forms. The belt and arms carved on some pillars support this. But the representation is geometric, symbolic. At Karahan Tepe, 11 kilometers away and apparently contemporary in age, the human form is rendered directly, realistically, and with emotional specificity. These are not 2 sites in sequence. They appear to be simultaneous, which means whoever built them had a range of artistic and conceptual approaches operating in parallel. They weren't progressing from primitive to sophisticated. They were already operating at multiple levels of representational complexity simultaneously 11,000 years ago. The excavation at Karahan Tepe is less than 10% complete. Karul has said publicly that he believes they are only beginning to understand what this complex actually is. The question isn't what they're finding. The question is what they haven't dug down to yet. Discovery number 10. The shape of what we're missing. Here is the pattern that runs through every discovery on this list. A mechanism that should have required 14 more centuries to invent, found in a shipwreck. A temple built by people who shouldn't have had the social organization to build it, found under a Turkish hill. Stone blocks whose tolerances we cannot fully replicate, sitting on a Bolivian altiplano. A map showing a continent no one was supposed to have seen in an Ottoman archive. An Amazon civilization nobody knew existed, found by a laser through the trees. A Bronze Age ship in deep water where Bronze Age ships weren't supposed to navigate. A site with life-size stone portraits carved 11,000 years ago, just beginning to be excavated. The mainstream position is that each of these anomalies has a specific, bounded explanation. The Antikythera Mechanism was a local, genius-level creation that didn't propagate. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that our model of social complexity was wrong, but doesn't require us to revise the overall timeline. Puma Punku's precision is attributable to techniques we haven't yet reverse-engineered, but that were human in origin. The Piri Reis map's southern coastline is coincidental alignment. Those explanations may all be right, but what they share, every single one of them, is the same structural response. Isolate the anomaly, assign it a local explanation, and resist the implication that connects them. The Antikythera Mechanism didn't come from nowhere. Someone taught someone else to cut gears to millimeter tolerances. There was a tradition, there was a knowledge base, there was something before it. Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by 3 people having a good day. There was planning, there was a labor force, there was a system of knowledge transmission across generations. The Piri Reis source maps that showed the subglacial Antarctic coastline came from somewhere. Some civilization at some point was sailing and surveying and recording what they found. The question isn't whether human beings were more sophisticated in the deep past than the standard model allows. The evidence on this list alone makes that conclusion almost unavoidable. The question is how much more sophisticated. And the reason nobody can answer that question is the same reason it keeps producing new anomalies every time archaeologists point a new instrument at old ground. We have excavated a fraction of what exists. We have surveyed a fraction of what's underwater. We have scanned a fraction of what's under the forest floor. History didn't begin with the civilizations we know. It began much earlier, and it was much more complex, and most of it is still in the ground, waiting.